In 1934, Dutch Schultz, the most feared mobster in New York, set Bumpy Johnson on fire inside a locked car with no way out. Bumpy survived. But surviving was only the beginning. What did Bumpy Johnson do next that made an entire city fall completely silent to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. The first thing you need to understand is this: the man was on fire. Not metaphorically. Not in the way people say someone burns with ambition or blazes with anger. Literally, on fire. His jacket was burning. His right arm was burning. The skin on his back was blistering through charred fabric. Steam rising from his wounds into the cold February air like smoke from a chimney. Every nerve ending in his body was screaming the same message: you are dying. Lie down. Stop. Let go. He didn't lie down. He stood up. That's the image that stopped 127th Street cold that night. Not the burning car behind him, though that was spectacular enough. Orange flames consuming a 1932 Buick sedan. Black smoke rolling up toward a moonless sky. Not the sound of fire eating through metal and leather. That deep, crackling roar that sounds like a tunnel with wind howling through it. What stopped people cold? What made a dozen witnesses press their faces against their windows and forget to breathe? Was the man in the middle of the street. He stood up. He reached both hands to his burning jacket. He ripped it off his body in one motion and threw it aside onto the pavement like it was nothing. Like it was a minor inconvenience. Like a man who had somewhere more important to be and couldn't be bothered with the distraction of being set on fire. Then he looked down the street toward the black Ford sedan idling 30 yards ahead, and he started walking toward it, not stumbling, not crawling, walking, with the kind of deliberate, unhurried purpose that made the watching witnesses understand something visceral and wordless, whoever those men in that Ford were. Whatever they had planned for tonight, they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Freeze on that image for a moment. A man with burned hands, blistered skin, wounds that should have had him unconscious on the pavement, choosing to walk toward danger instead of away from it. Ask yourself the question that every witness on that street was asking themselves at that exact moment. Who is this man? And what would have to be true about a person's life to make this the only response he knew? To answer that question, you need to go back past the burning car and the cold February night, back past the months of escalating war between two worlds that were never supposed to collide, back to the beginning of the story, which is not a story about crime at all. It is a story about survival. Harlem in 1934 was a neighborhood that the rest of New York had decided to forget. The Great Depression had arrived everywhere in America, but it had arrived in Harlem with a particular brutality. The way a storm that has already devastated one coastline arrives at the next one carrying all its accumulated fury. Unemployment among Black Americans was pushing 50%. Not the kind of unemployment where a man tightens his belt and waits for things to improve. The kind where families were losing their apartments on a Tuesday and sleeping in doorways by Thursday. The kind where children went to school hungry 3 days in a row and came home to find their mother had pawned the furniture to pay a debt that couldn't be paid. The legitimate economy had not just slowed down for Harlem, it had simply ceased to exist. But Harlem was not a neighborhood that broke quietly. It was a neighborhood that had learned, over decades of being excluded from every system that was supposed to protect it, to build its own systems from scratch, its own economy, its own rules, its own justice. And at the center of that alternative architecture, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually and employing hundreds of people who had nowhere else to turn, was the numbers game. The mechanics were simple enough. You chose a 3-digit number. You placed a nickel bet with your local runner, the young man who collected slips on your block every morning. If your number was drawn that afternoon, you won $25 for a family surviving on $7 a week. That nickel wasn't a gamble. It was the only remaining form of hope available at a reasonable price, and the woman who controlled that hope, who had built the most powerful numbers operation in Harlem through a combination of financial brilliance, iron nerve, and a genuine commitment to the community she served, was Madame Stephanie Saint. Claire, French Caribbean by birth, New Yorker by choice. She had arrived in America with nothing and had constructed an empire through sheer force of intelligence and will. She paid her runners well, far better than any legitimate employer in the neighborhood would. She covered rent for families facing eviction. She kept corrupt police officers off the backs of black-owned businesses, not by surrendering to them, but by outmaneuvering them, by knowing which levers to pull and which pressure points to press. In a city that had organized itself entirely around making black people invisible, Madame Saint. Claire made them matter. She was not a criminal in any meaningful sense of the word. She was the only functioning social infrastructure in a place that the government had abandoned. And she needed protection, not the kind that money alone could buy. She needed someone who understood that in Harlem. Respect was the only currency that actually held its value, and that respect had to be earned in ways that spreadsheets couldn't capture. She found that person in a 28-year-old from South Carolina named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Everyone called him Bumpy, 5 feet 9 inches tall, 160 pounds. Not physically imposing by any standard measure, but there was something in the way Bumpy Johnson moved through a room that recalibrated the calculations of every other person in it. He had been shot. He had been stabbed. He had been beaten in prison yards by men who outweighed him by 60 pounds, and every single time, he had gotten back up, recovered, and returned to exactly the same streets, wearing exactly the same expression of calm, focused intelligence that he always wore. People in Harlem said Bumpy Johnson was too stubborn to die. That was only part of the truth. The fuller truth was that Bumpy had spent his entire life in environments where death was a recurring feature of the landscape, and he had made a kind of peace with it that most people never reach. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't suicidal. He simply didn't allow fear to participate in his decision-making. And that absence of fear gave him a clarity that made him genuinely more dangerous than men who were bigger, better armed, and more numerous. He was exactly what Madame Saint, Claire, needed. And for years, the arrangement worked. Then Dutch Schultz looked south and saw Harlem. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, a German Jewish bootlegger from the Bronx who had built his fortune during Prohibition by being willing to do things that other men weren't. He was not the smartest man in organized crime, not by a significant margin, but he was among the most persistent. And persistence combined with a complete absence of squeamishness had carried him a long way. When Prohibition ended in December 1933, Dutch Schultz faced a problem that was existential in the most literal sense. The revenue stream that had funded everything, the money that paid his enforcers and bought his political protection and kept his operation functioning, had been legislated out of existence overnight. He needed new territory. He needed it fast, and he needed it to be lucrative enough to replace what he had lost. He looked at the numbers racket in Harlem and saw a perfect solution. What he failed to understand, because he had never taken the time to understand it, was that Harlem was not empty territory waiting to be claimed. It was not a vacuum that his organization could simply flow into. It was a living ecosystem with its own balance of power, its own rules of engagement, and its own immune response to foreign invasion. But here is the more important thing to understand about Dutch Schultz in the winter of 1934. He wasn't attacking Harlem because he was strong. He was attacking Harlem because he was afraid. And he knew it, and that knowledge was eating him alive. His lieutenants had begun asking questions that lieutenants are not supposed to ask. Quiet questions, asked in private, in the kind of careful voices that people use when they're testing whether a structure is still load-bearing. Questions about the future. Questions about whether there was a plan. Questions that, translated honestly, meant, is this man still the person we should be following? Dutch Schultz had built his entire reputation on being the most dangerous man in any room he entered. That reputation was not just ego. It was infrastructure. It was the thing that kept his organization functioning. That made people pay when he demanded payment and run when he told them to run. The moment people stopped believing it, everything collapsed. And so Harlem was not really about money. Harlem was about Dutch Schultz proving to himself and to everyone watching that he was still the same man he had always been. The most dangerous version of that kind of person is not the one at the peak of his power. It is the one who can feel his power beginning to slip, who watches it draining away and becomes willing to do absolutely anything to stop the bleeding. Dutch Schultz in early 1934 was that version of himself, cornered, desperate, and performing confidence with the practiced precision of a man who understood that the performance itself had become more important than anything it was supposed to represent. He sent his enforcers into Harlem with simple instructions: take the numbers operations by force, or burn them down. What followed over the next 6 months was unlike any conflict Dutch Schultz had encountered in his career. He was accustomed to wars that made noise, confrontations that happened in the open, that could be measured and tracked and responded to with overwhelming force. What Bumpy Johnson gave him instead was silence. Dutch would send 3 men to collect from a black policy banker on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, those 3 men had not returned. No one had seen them leave. No witnesses came forward. No bodies turned up. The policy banker was still open for business on Thursday, running his operation as though nothing had happened, because as far as anyone could officially confirm, nothing had. This was the part of Bumpy Johnson's genius that Dutch Schultz could never fully account for. Bumpy understood something fundamental about power in Harlem that Dutch, for all his experience, had never grasped. In Harlem, the community itself was the weapon, not in the sense of a mob or a militia. In the simpler, more profound sense that an entire neighborhood of people who trusted each other and shared a common interest in self-preservation could make things disappear, could render events invisible, could close ranks around their own with a completeness that no outside investigation could penetrate. Every runner who worked for St. Clair, every business owner who benefited from her protection, every family who had received help during a moment of crisis, every person in those streets who understood that what St. Clair had built was the only thing standing between their community and complete destitution. Every one of those people was Bumpy's eyes and ears and silence. Dutch was fighting not just one man. He was fighting a neighborhood that had decided, collectively and without any formal agreement, that this was a hill worth defending, and Dutch was losing. He just hadn't fully admitted it to himself yet. By early February 1934, 3 of his collectors had vanished without a trace. Dutch called a meeting. Paulie Romano, Mickey Sullivan, Tony Benz, his most reliable men. He laid out what he needed in terms that left no room for interpretation. The message had to be sent in a way that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be made to disappear, couldn't be absorbed quietly by Harlem's protective silence. The message had to be Bumpy Johnson. On the evening of February 15th, Bumpy spent several hours at Madame St. Clair's brownstone on 145th Street. They had been doing this for months, these late-evening strategy sessions, mapping the conflict, tracking Dutch's movements, identifying the pressure points. It was the kind of operational discipline that had kept St. Clair in power for over a decade, careful thinking combined with decisive action. never one without the other. But that evening, something was different. St. Clair was not her usual composed self. She paced twice across the room before sitting down, which she never did. She checked the window, which she rarely did. The tension in her sat differently than it usually did, less like a weapon ready to be deployed and more like a premonition she couldn't quite articulate. "Dutch is getting desperate," she said finally. "You can feel it in the way he's moving. Desperate men do stupid things, Bumpy, but they also do dangerous things, unpredictable things." Bumpy leaned back in his chair across the table from her and considered what she had said with the measured patience that was his most distinctive quality. He didn't answer immediately. He let the thought sit in the room for a moment before responding. "Good," he said. "Desperate men make mistakes, and mistakes are the only thing I need." St. Clair looked at him for a long moment. She had known Bumpy Johnson for years, had trusted him with things she trusted no one else with, and she understood him better than almost anyone. But in that moment, looking at the absolute stillness in his face, the calm that wasn't resignation but something harder and more considered, she felt something she couldn't name settle in the base of her chest. "Be careful tonight," she said as he stood to leave. "I mean it. I'm always careful," Bumpy said. He picked up his coat. "That's why I'm still here." He walked out into the cold and climbed into his car. The night was quiet. The streets were mostly empty. He drove south on Lenox Avenue without hurrying. Windows cracked slightly because he liked the cold air, the way it kept his mind sharp and present. He was 2 blocks from home when he noticed the Ford sedan pull out of a side street ahead of him and slow to a crawl. He had not yet noticed the car behind him, but somewhere deep in the instinct that years of surviving in hostile environments had developed in him, something registered. A small, quiet alarm. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply shifts the quality of your attention, makes your hands settle more firmly on the wheel, makes your breathing slow down and deepen. Bumpy Johnson had been in enough dangerous situations to know that the ones you survived were usually the ones where that alarm sounded early enough for you to hear it. He heard it. Dutch Schultz had spent 3 weeks designing what he believed was an inescapable trap. He had assigned his 3 most capable men to execute it. He had accounted for every variable he could think of, every contingency, every possible response from a target who was known to be intelligent, experienced, and extremely difficult to catch off guard. What Dutch had not accounted for, what none of them had accounted for, was the thing that made Bumpy Johnson different from every other man Dutch had ever moved against. You can plan for someone's strength. You can plan for their resources, their allies, their intelligence, their experience. What you cannot plan for is what happens when the thing you're counting on to break a man, fear, pain, the body's overwhelming instinct toward self-preservation simply isn't there. Paulie Romano had his bottles ready. Mickey Sullivan had the Ford positioned perfectly. Tony Benz waited 1 block back with his engine running. The trap was set, and Bumpy Johnson was driving straight into it without knowing that by the time this night was over, his name would mean something entirely different in Harlem than it had meant when the sun went down. Dutch Schultz had assembled the most dangerous plan of his career. Paulie Romano, a man who had never missed, was already leaning out the passenger window, and Bumpy Johnson was driving home, unaware that 127th Street was about to become the place where the word untouchable stopped being a reputation and became a fact. Mickey Sullivan had been running operations for Dutch Schultz for 11 years, and in 11 years, he had never lost a target. He sat in the dark interior of the Ford sedan on the corner of 129th and Lenox, engine idling low, watching the clock on the dashboard tick toward 11:30. The street outside was quiet the way February streets in Harlem were always quiet this late. Most people driven indoors by cold that had settled into the single digits. The kind of cold that made the air feel brittle, like glass that might shatter if you breathed too hard against it. Mickey liked this kind of night. Quiet nights were clean nights. No complications from pedestrians, no car horns, no crowds that could absorb a target and make things complicated. Tonight was going to be clean. He had spent 3 weeks on this plan. 3 weeks of watching Bumpy Johnson's movements, mapping his routes, identifying the window of maximum vulnerability. And he had found it here, on this stretch of Lenox between 129th and 127th, where the street narrowed slightly between 2 rows of brownstones and there was no side exit for 400 feet in either direction. A corridor, a funnel, the kind of geography that turned an escape route into a cage. The plan had 4 components, each one a redundancy built on top of the last. The Ford would pull out ahead of Bumpy's Buick and slow to a crawl, blocking forward movement. Tony Benz would close the gap from behind, sealing the rear. Paulie Romano, seated in the Ford's passenger seat with 2 prepared bottles and a lighter that had never once failed him, would handle the primary action. And Tony, parked 1 block back with a clear sight line to the entire operation, was the insurance policy. The answer to the question that Mickey had learned to always ask, what if something goes wrong? Nothing was going to go wrong. "You nervous?" Paulie had asked earlier that evening, turning one of the glass bottles over slowly in his hands, checking the wick with the kind of careful attention a craftsman gives to a tool he is about to use. "No," Mickey said. "You should be a little nervous. Keeps you sharp." "I'm plenty sharp. I'm just not nervous." Mickey had looked at him across the seat. "You ever been nervous before a job?" Paulie thought about it. Once. First time. Never after. That's because after the first time you understand it's just mechanics. You set up the conditions. You execute the steps. The outcome follows. It's not complicated. Mickey checked the mirror. Empty street behind them. Johnson's smart. I'll give him that. But smart doesn't matter when the geometry is right. He's going to drive into this corridor and he's going to have approximately 2 seconds to understand what's happening. 2 seconds is not enough time for Smart to save you. Paulie nodded slowly. "You want to bet on it?" Mickey almost smiled. "I'll bet you a week's wages he doesn't even get his door open." Paulie Romano extended his hand. They shook on it. That handshake, that easy confidence of 2 professionals who had never been given a reason to doubt themselves, was also the thing that would undo them. Because the fatal flaw in every plan built on certainty is the assumption that the target will behave like a target, that they will panic, that they will freeze, that the body's overwhelming instinct toward self-preservation will override everything else and make them predictable. Mickey Sullivan had studied Bumpy Johnson for 3 weeks. He had watched where he walked, who he spoke to, what time he left and arrived. What he had not studied, because he did not believe it was relevant, was what kind of man Bumpy Johnson actually was on the inside, what he was made of at a level that no surveillance could measure. That omission was about to cost him everything. At 23 minutes past 11, Mickey saw the headlights of a 1932 Buick sedan turn onto Lenox Avenue from 135th Street, moving south at a steady, unhurried pace. He picked up the radio receiver and clicked it twice. The signal to Tony Benz. 1 block back. Everything is in position. It begins now. He put the Ford in gear and pulled out slowly from the side street, easing into Lenox Avenue ahead of the Buick, matching his speed to just below 10 miles per hour. Blocking. Trapping. The corridor closing around its target like a hand making a fist. Inside the Buick, Bumpy Johnson saw the Ford pull out and slow down in front of him. His first reading of it was neutral, a driver unsure of his direction, or someone who had had too much to drink and was navigating badly. He tapped his horn once. The Ford didn't react, kept crawling forward, steady and deliberate. The second reading came faster. It arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. Something tightening in the back of his neck. A shift in his body's baseline that his years of experience had trained him to recognize immediately. He checked his mirror. A second car. 20 yards back, matching his reduced speed exactly. Not a drunk driver. His right hand moved beneath the seat toward the .45 he kept there, but the Ford's passenger window was already rolling down. And what came next happened in the span of 8 seconds that would become the most documented 8 seconds in the history of Harlem. Paulie Romano leaned out the window with 2 glass bottles, cloth wicks already burning, flames dancing in the February wind with a cheerful indifference to what they were about to do. He had performed this motion dozens of times. The mechanics were in his muscles. He didn't need to think. He just needed to release. The first bottle arced upward and came down directly onto the Buick's hood. Glass detonated. Gasoline spread across the metal in a sheet. The burning wick met the fuel, and the hood became an orange wall of fire in under 2 seconds. Heat slamming against the windshield with enough force to crack the glass at the edges. Inside the car, in the half-second between seeing the first bottle leave Paulie's hand and watching the hood ignite, Bumpy Johnson's mind did something that no one who has not experienced genuine crisis-level training can fully appreciate. It did not panic. It did not flood with adrenaline and narrow to a single, desperate impulse. Instead, with a speed and clarity that was almost architectural, it assessed. Forward into the Ford possible, but Paulie still has the second bottle. Reverse the car behind as close to 15 yards. Contact is certain. Door move toward it and you're exposed before you're clear. 3 options evaluated and eliminated in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Then the second bottle came through the cracked passenger window. This one Paulie threw flatter. Harder. A trajectory calculated to clear the window frame and reach the interior. It hit the back of the passenger seat, and the world inside that car became a different place entirely. Gasoline soaked the seat, the dashboard, the steering wheel, Bumpy's right sleeve. The heat from the hood fire ignited the fuel almost instantly. His jacket caught. Here is what happened next that was different from what Paulie and Mickey and Tony Benz had planned for. Different from what every version of this operation was designed to produce. Most people, when fire touches their body, when they feel that first contact of flame on fabric and the immediate bloom of pain radiating outward from the point of contact, enter a state that psychologists call reactive panic. The thinking brain goes offline. The body takes over, and the body's command, overriding everything else, is simply get away from the fire. Run, scream, tear at the burning clothing without strategy, move without direction. Bumpy Johnson did not enter reactive panic. What he entered instead was a state of absolute, almost supernatural focus. The pain was real. The burns spreading across his right arm and shoulder were real. Second-degree damage radiating heat into his skin that would leave scars he would carry for the rest of his life. But the pain did not occupy the command center of his mind. It moved to the side and waited, the way a good soldier waits when his officer is still thinking through the problem. The windshield, already cracked from the hood fire's heat. He braced against the seat and drove both feet into the glass. First kick, the fracture spread. Second kick, the spiderweb pattern reached the frame. Third kick, the windshield gave way. He grabbed the steering wheel with both hands, pulled himself forward through the opening, rolled over the burning hood, and hit the pavement below. From the windows above, 12 people watched this happen and did not make a sound. Mrs. Dorothy Williams, 3rd floor, had been awake with a restless child when the noise outside pulled her to the window. She saw the burning car first, and her hand was already reaching for the telephone when the figure emerged from the fire. She stopped moving. Her child, sensing the change in her, went quiet against her shoulder. Young Malcolm, 12 years old, second floor, had been reading by lamplight when the orange glow painted his ceiling. He went to the window and pressed his face against the cold glass and saw something he would spend years trying to describe to people who hadn't been there, always feeling like the words fell short of the reality. Mr. Jefferson, fourth floor, retired, had his hand on his telephone receiver when his wife put her hand over his and shook her head without speaking. He understood her meaning completely. He set the receiver down, and Mickey Sullivan, sitting in the Ford 20 yards ahead, watched through his rear window as the figure he had just set on fire stood up in the middle of 127th Street, and felt something happen inside his chest that he had no name for. It was not fear exactly. It was something more disorienting than fear. It was the sensation of a man who has built his entire identity on the certainty that his plans work, watching his plan not work, watching the foundational logic of his professional life simply stop being true. He reached for the ignition. His hands were shaking. He told them to stop, and they didn't listen. The plan had no step for this. There was no contingency for the target standing up, because the target was not supposed to stand up. The target was supposed to be on the pavement, overwhelmed. Finished, the job done and the Ford already 3 blocks away. Instead, the Ford was still here. Mickey's hands were still shaking, and Bumpy Johnson had ripped his burning jacket off his body with burned hands and thrown it into the street and was looking directly at the car, looking directly at Mickey, and starting to move toward him. What followed happened with the terrible momentum of something that cannot be stopped once it has begun. Bumpy crossed the distance in 10 seconds that felt to everyone watching like 10 minutes. 10 seconds of burned feet on cold pavement. 10 seconds of lungs working through smoke damage. 10 seconds during which Mickey finally got the key in the ignition and turned it, and the engine coughed and caught, and then Bumpy's hand was on the driver's door, and the sound of that door being yanked open echoed down 127th Street like a gunshot. Mickey screamed. Not a controlled sound. Not a tough man's sound. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below the ego. From the part of a person that exists before they learn to perform toughness. Bumpy pulled him out of the car with both hands. Burned hands. Hands that should have been incapable of generating that kind of force. Hands that closed around Mickey Sullivan's coat collar and did not let go. 12 windows above. 12 witnesses. Not one of them looked away. 45 seconds later, Mickey Sullivan was no longer a threat to anyone. Paulie Romano had been running since the moment Bumpy stood up. He was a former boxer, lean and fast, and he had a 30-second lead and terror in his legs that was adding speed he didn't know he had. He ran east, then north, cutting toward 131st Street, working through the grid of Harlem streets he had studied on a map but had never truly understood as a place where people lived, where every shadow knew whose side it was on. Bumpy left the Ford behind and ran after him. This is the part of the story that is hardest to explain to someone who wasn't there, because it defies the ordinary arithmetic of physical capacity. Bumpy Johnson's body at that moment was, by any clinical measure, failing. The burns on his arm and back were deep enough to require hospitalization. The smoke in his lungs had reduced his oxygen intake significantly. The blisters on both hands had burst during the confrontation with Mickey, leaving raw nerve endings exposed to the February air. At 129th Street. His legs gave out for just a moment, and he caught himself against a building with one hand and stood there for 3 seconds with his vision graying at the edges. 30 yards ahead, he could see Paulie Romano's back, getting smaller. He pushed off the wall and ran again. Because here is the calculation Bumpy Johnson made in those 3 seconds against the building. Not an emotional calculation, a strategic one, cold and clear as the February air. If Paulie Romano reached Dutch Schultz and reported that Bumpy had survived, Dutch would have no choice but to escalate. 10 men next time, 20. The kind of operation that couldn't be absorbed by silence, that couldn't be made to disappear. This night, this specific night, was the only chance to end this completely. And Bumpy Johnson had not survived a burning car to leave the job half-finished. Will, at that moment, was simply stronger than physics. He caught Paulie Romano at the corner of 131st and 7th Avenue. And what happened there in the dark, quiet intersection, witnessed by no one except the buildings and the cold and the indifferent February sky, was the second chapter of a message that the whole of Harlem would be reading by morning. Paulie Romano tried to beg. He got one sentence out, something about children, something about being sorry. And Bumpy didn't answer him because Bumpy was not interested in conversation. He was interested in finishing what needed to be finished. Paulie Romano did not get up from that corner. Bumpy stood there in the silence afterward, breathing in ragged pulls, his whole body shaking with a combination of adrenaline and pain, and the particular exhaustion that comes after the body has been asked to do something it was never designed to do. The burns were winning now. The edges of his vision were uncertain. The blisters on his hands had gone from screaming pain to something deeper and more serious. A heavy throb that meant the damage was real and would need real treatment. 1 block south. Tony Benz sat in his car with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and a loaded revolver in his lap. And he had watched all of it. He had watched Bumpy walk out of the fire. He had watched what happened to Mickey. He had watched Bumpy chase Paulie Romano 3 blocks on burned feet and not slow down, not give up. Tony Benz had been doing this work for a long time. He had seen men who were hard to stop. He had seen men who were hard to scare. He had never in his life seen a man who seemed entirely indifferent to the question of whether he lived or died, who moved through catastrophic physical damage with the focused patience of someone completing a task. His orders were clear. If Bumpy survived the fire, Tony Benz would finish the job. That was why he was here. That was what Dutch was paying him for. Tony picked up the revolver. He looked through the windshield at Bumpy Johnson standing over Paulie Romano's still form, 20 yards away, barely upright, hands shaking visibly even from this distance. This was the easiest shot Tony had been asked to take in 11 years of this work. A burned, exhausted man at close range, standing still, in no condition to react. He should pull the trigger. He had been paid to pull the trigger. Everything about the professional logic of the situation demanded that he pull the trigger. Tony Benz's finger stayed where it was, because in the 10 seconds he sat there looking at Bumpy Johnson. Something happened in Tony's mind that he would never fully be able to articulate to anyone, including himself. It wasn't compassion, it wasn't mercy. It was something closer to a fundamental disruption of his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. He had built his career, his identity, his entire sense of professional competence on a simple and reliable equation: sufficient force, correctly applied, produces predictable results. Fire kills. Numbers overwhelm. The body has limits that cannot be transcended by willpower alone. Everything he had just witnessed in the last 4 minutes had broken that equation completely. He could shoot Bumpy Johnson. He understood that. The bullet would be real. The damage would be real. But somewhere in the animal core of Tony Benz's understanding, below the professional calculation and the trained nerve, lived a new and terrifying question that he could not unask. What if it doesn't stop him? Tony put the car in gear. He pulled out onto 7th Avenue slowly. The way a man moves when he is trying to convince himself he is making a rational decision rather than running from something he doesn't have words for. He leaned out the window with the revolver and fired twice, because Dutch Schultz would ask whether he had tried, and Tony needed to be able to say yes. The first shot went wide. The second punched through a parked car's window. Bumpy had already moved, dropping behind the vehicle with a speed that had no business existing in a man in his condition. And the return shot that came from behind the car caught Tony in the right shoulder, with enough force to make him drop the revolver and slam both hands onto the wheel. He drove north on 7th Avenue and did not look back. Behind him, Bumpy Johnson lowered the borrowed gun and sat down on the curb next to Paulie Romano's body. Not because he chose to sit, because his legs finally submitted their resignation. The adrenaline was completely gone now, and what replaced it was the full, unmediated weight of everything his body had absorbed in the last 20 minutes. Burns, smoke, impact, exertion at a level that left no reserves anywhere. He sat there, and he breathed, and after a moment, very quietly, in the cold and the dark and the silence of 127th Street at 24 minutes before midnight on February 15th, 1934, Bumpy Johnson allowed himself the smallest possible version of a smile. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the recognition of a man who had done what needed to be done and was still alive to know it. The next morning, Dutch Schultz sat in his Bronx office while Tony Benz delivered his report to a room full of men who had stopped breathing. When Tony finished speaking, Dutch was quiet for a very long time. Then he asked a single question. Not about Bumpy, not about Mickey or Paulie. A question that every man in that room understood immediately, because it told them everything about what Dutch had already decided. He asked his accountant, "How much is Harlem actually worth?" The accountant's answer was precise. $40,000 gross per month, $15,000 net after costs, payoffs, and operational expenses. Dutch Schultz listened to those numbers without moving, without changing his expression, with the particular stillness of a man who is running calculations that have nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with the uncomfortable arithmetic of pride versus survival. Then he turned to Tony Benz. "If I gave you 20 men," Dutch said quietly, "and sent you back to Harlem tomorrow, could you finish it?" The room had 8 people in it. All 8 of them looked at Tony. Tony Benz had a bandaged shoulder and the eyes of someone who had not slept since February 15th, and he held Dutch's gaze for a long moment before he answered. The pause itself was already an answer, but Dutch waited for the words. "No," Tony said, "I couldn't." "Why not?" "Because it's not about the men." Tony's voice was flat, emptied of everything except the truth he had been carrying for 3 days. You can send 20 and some won't come back. You send 40. Same result. It's not Bumpy Johnson you're fighting, boss. It's the whole neighborhood, every window, every doorway, every person on every block. They're all him. You can't beat that with numbers because the numbers never end on their side. Dutch said nothing. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking south toward a borough that was not the Bronx. And the men seated behind him understood that the silence was not anger. It was not wounded pride. It was the sound of a very intelligent and very dangerous man accepting a conclusion he had spent weeks resisting, turning it over one final time, and setting it down. His accountant broke the quiet carefully. "The operation last week cost us $8,000 against $15,000 net for the month. One failed operation consumed more than half the monthly profit. If we escalate and the pattern continues—" "I know what escalation costs," Dutch said, without turning around. He stood at the window for another long moment, long enough that two of the men at the table exchanged a glance. Then he said the sentence that ended the war. "Pull everyone out, every collector, every man, every operation. Harlem is finished for us." One of his lieutenants drew breath to object. Dutch turned from the window, and whatever was on his face closed that objection before it became sound. Not rage, not the theatrical fury that Dutch was capable of deploying when he wanted to remind people who he was. Something quieter and more final. The expression of a man who has finished thinking and does not intend to think about it again. "Bumpy Johnson survived being set on fire," Dutch said. "He handled two of my best people with burned hands, and then put a bullet in Tony from 30 yards in the dark while barely standing. And the next morning, every single person who watched it happen told the police they were asleep." He picked up his coat from the back of the chair and held it without putting it on. "That is not one man. That is a neighborhood that has decided he is worth protecting at any cost. You cannot buy that loyalty. You cannot threaten it into silence because it is already silent by choice. And you cannot defeat it, because every time you try, you are not fighting a person. You are fighting an idea that those people have about themselves." He paused at the door and said the last thing quietly, almost to himself. "And ideas don't bleed." He walked out. No one spoke for a very long time after the door closed. That decision, stripped of ego, built entirely on cold analysis, was perhaps the most honest thing Dutch Schultz ever did in his career. He had built his empire on the willingness to go further than anyone else, to absorb costs that other men wouldn't absorb, to push past points where rational people stopped. What he demonstrated that morning in the Bronx required something different and in some ways harder than ruthlessness. It required him to look clearly at the shape of a situation and speak the truth of it aloud, even when that truth made him smaller in the eyes of the men who worked for him. Some leaders cannot do that. Dutch Schultz, whatever else he was, could. Bumpy Johnson did not learn about Dutch's withdrawal until 3 days later. Still recovering at Dr. Hayes's house, his arm wrapped in fresh gauze, the morphine finally allowing the pain to settle into something that resembled a background frequency rather than the only thing in the room. St. Clair came herself to deliver the news, which told him everything about how seriously she was taking it. She sat across from him in Hayes's small examination room and said it plainly. Dutch pulled every man out of Harlem. Every operation, every collector. It's over. Bumpy. He nodded slowly, in the way a man nods when he is confirming something he already understood was coming, rather than receiving new information. "You won," St. Clair said, and there was something in her voice underneath the relief, something more textured than simple victory. That matched the look she had given him at the door 5 nights ago when he walked out into the cold. "I survived," Bumpy said. "That's not the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "In Harlem, it is exactly the same thing." He didn't argue with her, because she was right. And he knew it. And that knowledge was precisely what was sitting heavy in his chest as he lay there, in Hayes' examination room, with his bandaged hands resting on the blanket. Survival in Harlem was not merely a personal outcome. It was a public statement. It was something that other people read meaning into, built hope from, used to calibrate what was possible for themselves. And he had just survived something that was not supposed to be survivable. That understanding was what met him fully when, a week later, he walked out of Hayes's house and stood on the February sidewalk for the first time since the fire. He stood still for a moment and looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window beside the door. The burns on his right arm had closed into tight, shiny scar tissue, slightly raised at the edges, pulling the skin into a new and permanent configuration. His left palm carried the curved mark of the superheated door handle, a ridge that ran across the base of his fingers like a second lifeline written in a language that only fire speaks. His back, beneath his shirt and coat, held patches where the heat had pressed deep enough to leave texture that would never fully smooth away. He looked at those marks for a long time, long enough that the cold began to work its way through his coat, not with pride, not with grief or bitterness, with the sober, unflinching inventory of a man who understands that what has happened to him is not finished happening yet, that the event does not end when the wounds close. Something had shifted on the night of February 15th in the way that Harlem understood him, and that shift was irreversible. He was no longer simply a man with a formidable reputation that people respected from a careful distance. He had become something closer to a living proof, a demonstration, walking and breathing and visible on Lenox Avenue, of the proposition that some things cannot be taken from you by force. That was its own kind of weight, heavier, in the long run, than the burns themselves. Because a man heals from fire, given enough time and the right care. Scar tissue forms. The body makes its accommodations. What does not heal so cleanly is the responsibility of being the fixed point that other people navigate by. The thing they point to when they need evidence that dignity is defensible, that power is not automatically right simply because it is power, that a community can protect its own if it chooses to do so with enough collective conviction. Bumpy Johnson would carry that weight through Harlem for the next 4 decades, making decisions that no one envied, standing between his neighborhood and threats that never entirely stopped arriving, paying costs that accumulated in ways that financial ledgers are not designed to capture. All of it traceable back to one cold street, one burning car, and the choice he made to stand up when every rational signal in his body said to stay down. It started here, on a February sidewalk, with scarred hands and clear eyes, holding the full weight of what it meant to have survived, and understanding that surviving was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything that came next. Harlem did not remember Bumpy Johnson because he defeated Dutch Schultz. Plenty of men had beaten Dutch Schultz in one way or another over the years, outmaneuvered him, outlasted him, refused his terms, and lived to tell about it. That was not what made the night of February 15th into the story that people were still telling decades later, in barbershops and church steps and kitchen tables across the neighborhood. Harlem remembered Bumpy Johnson because of the 12 people in 12 separate windows who watched what happened on that street and made a choice. They set down their telephones. They closed their curtains. They told the detective who knocked on their doors the following morning that they had been asleep. Heard nothing. Seen nothing. Had no information that could possibly be useful to the investigation. 12 people. 12 separate decisions, none of them coordinated, none of them discussed in advance, all of them arriving at the same place through the same logic, which was not really logic at all, but something deeper and more durable. He was theirs, and you do not surrender what is yours. That collective silence, invisible to official record, absent from every document filed in NYPD Case 3847, impossible to legislate or confiscate or destroy, was the most powerful thing that happened on 127th Street that night. More powerful than fire. More powerful than anything Dutch Schultz had ever been able to buy or threaten into existence, because the silence was freely given, by people who owed nothing to any institution and chose anyway to protect one of their own. Real power was never what Dutch Schultz had. Real power was what those 12 people demonstrated when they said nothing. It is what every runner who worked for St. Clair demonstrated when they kept working. It is what Harlem demonstrated, collectively and continuously, by deciding that some things were worth defending past the point where the calculation made obvious sense. You can take money. You can dismantle organizations. You can remove individuals from the equation through force or fear or both. What you cannot do is reach into the space between people who trust each other and extract the trust itself. What you cannot burn is the thing that makes a community, rather than just a collection of people occupying the same geography. Fire is loud. It announces itself. It consumes what it touches and leaves permanent marks on everything it reaches. Bumpy Johnson carried those marks on his skin for the rest of his life, and everyone who saw them knew the story behind them, and the story meant the same thing every time it was told. Some things cannot be taken. Some people cannot be broken. And some neighborhoods, when they decide to stand together, become something that no amount of force can move. That is what the night of February 15th proved. That is why the name still matters. That is why, all these years later, it always will.